The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Richardson Burger on Maple Street, its golden arches gleaming against the pale sky. David Richardson adjusted the worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, checking his reflection in the side mirror of his rental car. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by faded jeans and a plain t-shirt that still felt foreign against his skin. At 52, he had built an empire of fast food restaurants, but today he was simply Dave, a middle-aged man looking for work. He pushed through the glass doors, the familiar chime announcing his arrival. The scent of grilled beef and French fries filled his nostrils, a smell that had once meant success and profit margins. Now it would be the backdrop to his undercover investigation into why this particular location consistently underperformed despite being in a prime area. The morning rush was in full swing, customers lined up at the counter while the kitchen hummed with controlled chaos. David's trained eye immediately caught the efficiency of the operation, the way orders moved seamlessly from register to preparation area. This wasn't the picture of dysfunction his district manager had painted. Behind the counter, a young woman with tired eyes managed 3 customers simultaneously, her movements precise despite the obvious fatigue. The grill area drew his attention next, where a man worked with quiet concentration, his hands moving with practiced expertise as he assembled burgers with an almost artistic precision. Marcus Chen stood at the grill station, his black hair showing the first hints of gray at the temples. His uniform was spotless despite the heat and steam surrounding him, and there was something in his posture that spoke of dignity maintained against difficult circumstances. He worked without the hurried panic David had seen in so many kitchens, instead moving with the confidence of someone who understood his craft completely. A harsh voice cut through the kitchen noise like a blade. Karen Mills, the manager, emerged from the back office with a clipboard clutched in her manicured hands. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her lips were pressed into a permanent line of disapproval. "You're 2 minutes behind on the breakfast sandwiches," she snapped at Marcus, her voice carrying across the kitchen. "The customers don't care about your precious presentation. They want fast food, not fine dining." Marcus didn't look up from the grill, but David caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied quietly, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of careful English learned as a second language. "I'll pick up the pace." David watched this exchange with growing interest. In his years of running restaurants, he had learned to read the subtle dynamics between staff members. There was something here, an undercurrent of tension that went beyond the normal stress of a busy morning. The assistant manager, a burly man named Tony, approached David with a welcoming smile. "You must be the new guy," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Tony Rodriguez. Karen told me to expect you." "Dave Miller," David replied, using the fake name he had prepared. "Thanks for giving me a shot. I really need the work." Tony's expression softened with understanding. "We've all been there, man. Let me show you around, and then we'll get you started on training. The pay isn't great, but the work is steady if you're reliable." As Tony led him through the restaurant, David's attention kept drifting back to Marcus. The man worked with an economy of movement that spoke of years of experience, yet there was something about his situation that didn't quite fit. The way he handled the equipment suggested familiarity with restaurant operations beyond what a line cook would typically possess. During a brief lull, David noticed Marcus step outside for what appeared to be a phone call. Through the window, he watched as Marcus's shoulders sagged slightly, his free hand running through his hair in a gesture of frustration or worry. The conversation was brief, but when Marcus returned, there was a heaviness in his step that hadn't been there before. The lunch rush began building, and David found himself assigned to simple tasks while observing the kitchen dynamics. Marcus naturally took charge during the busiest periods, quietly directing the flow of orders and ensuring quality standards were met. Other staff members seemed to gravitate toward him for guidance, despite Karen's official authority. But it was during a particularly hectic moment that David witnessed something that would stay with him. A customer had returned a burger, claiming it was cold, though David suspected the complaint was more about the wait time than the food quality. Karen's response was swift and cutting. "This is exactly the kind of carelessness that's killing our numbers," she announced loudly, holding up the returned burger. "Marcus, this came from your station. Do you understand what this costs us?" Marcus nodded silently, accepting the criticism without argument, though David could see the food had been prepared correctly. The other staff members looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing the unfairness of the situation. "Where in the world are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? I hope you're somewhere comfortable, because this story is about to take you on a journey that might change how you see the people who serve you every day." As the lunch rush continued, David began to piece together a picture that troubled him deeply. Marcus worked longer hours than anyone else, often staying late to handle tasks that weren't technically his responsibility. He covered for other employees when they called in sick, and he maintained equipment with the skill of someone who understood the mechanical aspects of restaurant operations. Yet Karen treated him with a dismissive attitude that bordered on contempt. She questioned his every decision, criticized his methods, and seemed to take particular pleasure in undermining his confidence in front of other staff members. It was a pattern of behavior that David found increasingly difficult to stomach. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, and David noticed how Marcus interacted with each order as if it mattered personally to him. A child's Happy Meal was assembled with extra care, ensuring the toy was included and the apple slices were fresh. An elderly customer's burger was prepared exactly to specification, with the special requests noted and fulfilled without complaint. During his break, David stepped outside and found Marcus sitting on a crate near the dumpster, his lunch untouched beside him. The man was staring at his phone, and David could see the unmistakable tracks of tears on his cheeks. The sight hit David with unexpected force, this quiet moment of private pain from a man who had shown nothing but professionalism throughout the day. Marcus quickly wiped his eyes when he noticed David approaching, straightening his shoulders and forcing a smile. "Taking a break too?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Yeah, just needed some air," David replied, settling onto another crate. "Long day." "They are all long days," Marcus said softly, tucking his phone away. "But we do what we must do." There was something in those words, a weight of responsibility and sacrifice that spoke of challenges beyond the normal struggles of working in fast food. David found himself wondering about this man's story, about the circumstances that had brought someone with such obvious skills and dignity to accept treatment that no one should have to endure. As they sat in companionable silence, David made a decision that would change everything. This investigation had started as a routine check on an underperforming location, but it was becoming something much more personal. He was going to find out who Marcus Chen really was, and why a man of such obvious capability was allowing himself to be treated as if he were disposable. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of orders and observations, but David's focus had shifted. He was no longer just watching the operation, he was studying the people, particularly the quiet man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders while maintaining a dignity that no amount of harsh treatment could diminish. As closing time approached, David realized that tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. He had questions that needed answers, and a growing suspicion that Marcus Chen was far more than he appeared to be. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the darkness of Marcus Chen's small apartment at 5:30 in the morning. He reached across the narrow bed to silence it before the sound could wake Emma, though he knew she was already stirring in the next room. The walls were thin in their subsidized housing complex, and every sound carried between the cramped spaces they called home. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, gathering the strength he would need for another day. His back ached from the long hours on his feet, and his hands still smelled faintly of grease despite the thorough scrubbing he gave them each night. Around him, the small bedroom held the sparse belongings of a man who had learned to live with less than he had ever imagined possible. The soft sound of Emma's voice calling for him brought a genuine smile to his face, the first real expression of joy he had allowed himself in hours. He padded quietly to her room, where his 80-year-old daughter was already attempting to transfer herself from bed to wheelchair with the determined independence that both amazed and worried him. "Good morning, little star," he said softly, kneeling beside her bed. "Let me help you with that." Emma's face lit up with the kind of pure happiness that made every sacrifice worthwhile. She had his dark hair and bright eyes, but her spirit was entirely her own. The accident that had changed both their lives had taken her ability to walk, but it had never dimmed the light that seemed to radiate from her very being. "Daddy, I dreamed about the ocean again," she said as he helped her settle into her wheelchair. "We were building sandcastles, and the waves were singing to us." Marcus's heart clenched at the innocent wish in her voice. The ocean was 300 miles away, and their budget barely covered the basics of daily life. But he had learned to nurture her dreams even when his own had been buried under the weight of medical bills and minimum wage paychecks. "That sounds beautiful, sweetheart," he replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Maybe someday we'll see the ocean together." The morning routine was a carefully choreographed dance of necessity. Marcus prepared Emma's breakfast while she got dressed, their small kitchen barely large enough for one person to work comfortably. The refrigerator held generic cereal, milk that would expire in 2 days, and the components for the simple lunches he packed for both of them. As Emma ate her cereal, Marcus reviewed the stack of bills that seemed to grow larger each week. The rent was due in 5 days, and he was still $40 short. Emma's physical therapy sessions were helping, but even with their sliding scale fees, the cost stretched his budget beyond breaking. The school bus would arrive in 20 minutes, and Marcus had learned to time everything precisely. Emma's wheelchair needed to be positioned just right at the bus stop, and he had to ensure she had everything she needed for the day. Her book bag was carefully packed with homework, her medication, and the small lunch that represented a significant portion of their daily food budget. "What are you going to do at work today, Daddy?" Emma asked as he helped her put on her jacket. "I'm going to cook the best burgers in the city," he replied, forcing enthusiasm into his voice. "And I'm going to think about you the whole time." Emma giggled, the sound filling their small apartment with warmth. "Will you tell me about the people you meet? I like your stories about the customers." Marcus had started sharing carefully edited versions of his workday with Emma, transforming the mundane interactions into little adventures that sparked her imagination. He left out the harsh words from Karen, the exhaustion that made his bones ache, and the constant worry about making ends meet. The bus arrival was always bittersweet. Emma's excitement about school was infectious, but Marcus worried constantly about her well-being when he couldn't be there to protect her. The other children were generally kind, but he knew how cruel young people could be to those who were different. "Have a wonderful day, little star," he said, kissing her forehead as the bus driver helped her aboard. "Remember that Daddy loves you more than all the stars in the sky." Emma's bright smile was the last thing he saw before the bus pulled away, carrying with it the most precious part of his world. The silence that followed was always difficult, the apartment suddenly feeling too empty and too full of worry at the same time. Marcus had 45 minutes before his shift started, time he used to walk the 2 miles to Richardson Burger. The bus fare was 50 cents each way, money he couldn't afford to spend when his legs could carry him just as well. The walk also gave him time to prepare mentally for the day ahead, to build the wall of professional composure that would protect him from Karen's criticism and the customer's occasional impatience. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the promise of a busy day. Marcus walked with purpose, his mind already focused on the tasks that awaited him. He knew every shortcut through the neighborhood, every crack in the sidewalk that might catch Emma's wheelchair wheels on their weekend walks. As he approached the restaurant, Marcus could see the early morning prep work beginning inside. The delivery trucks were already making their rounds, and the opening crew was setting up for another day of controlled chaos. This was his world now, so different from the executive offices and conference rooms where he had once made decisions that affected entire regions. The back door was propped open to let in the cool morning air, and Marcus could hear Karen's voice already carrying across the kitchen. She was reviewing the previous day's numbers with Tony, her tone sharp with disapproval over costs and waste percentages that Marcus knew were actually quite reasonable for their volume. Marcus clocked in exactly on time, as he always did, and began his opening checklist with methodical precision. The grill needed to be cleaned and preheated, the prep stations required fresh supplies, and the equipment needed its daily safety inspection. These were tasks he could perform without conscious thought, his hands moving with the muscle memory of thousands of similar mornings. It was during this quiet preparation time that Marcus allowed himself to think about the dreams he had once harbored. There had been a time when he managed 3 restaurants, when his opinions carried weight in corporate meetings, when Emma's future had seemed bright and unlimited. Those days felt like someone else's life now, a story he might have read in a book about a different man entirely. The first customers would arrive soon, and with them would come the familiar rhythm of orders and preparation that defined his days. Marcus straightened his shoulders, adjusted his name tag, and prepared to face another day of quiet dignity in the face of circumstances that had tested every limit of his endurance. The lunch rush hit Richardson Burger like a tidal wave, transforming the quiet morning preparation into a symphony of controlled chaos. Orders streamed in faster than the display screen could refresh, and the kitchen filled with the urgent energy that Marcus had learned to navigate with practiced ease. His hands moved across the grill with precision, each burger receiving the exact attention it required despite the mounting pressure. David watched from his training station near the fryer, ostensibly learning the procedures for cooking French fries but actually studying the intricate dance of the kitchen staff. Marcus had naturally assumed an unofficial leadership role, quietly coordinating the flow of orders and ensuring that quality standards remained high even as the pace intensified. The phone at the prep station rang shrilly, cutting through the noise of sizzling meat and beeping timers. Marcus glanced toward it, but his hands were full with a complex order that required his complete attention. The phone continued ringing, its insistent tone growing more urgent with each unanswered call. Karen emerged from her office like a storm cloud, her face flushed with irritation. "Someone answer that phone," she snapped, her voice carrying across the kitchen. "We're not running a charity here." Marcus looked up from the grill, his expression apologetic. "I can get it as soon as I finish this order," he said, gesturing toward the row of burgers that were approaching perfect doneness. "These are almost ready." "Now means now," Karen replied sharply. "Tony, take over Marcus's station." "Marcus, answer the phone and make it quick." The transition was awkward, with Tony scrambling to take over the precise timing that Marcus had been maintaining. Marcus wiped his hands quickly on his apron and reached for the phone, his movements careful and deliberate despite the obvious urgency. "Hello, this is Marcus," he said into the receiver, his voice maintaining its professional calm despite the chaos around him. The conversation that followed was brief but devastating in its quiet desperation. David couldn't hear the words from the other end, but he could read the progression of emotions that crossed Marcus's face. Initial concern gave way to something deeper, a kind of weary resignation that spoke of battles fought too many times with outcomes that never seemed to change. "I understand," Marcus said quietly into the phone. "Can you give me until Friday? I should have the payment by then." The pause that followed stretched like an eternity, filled with the sounds of the busy kitchen and the weight of unspoken worry. "Yes, I know it's overdue," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "My daughter needs those sessions. Please, just until Friday." When Marcus hung up the phone, his shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. The professional mask remained in place, but David caught the moment of vulnerability that flickered across his features before being carefully hidden away. Karen had been watching the entire exchange with growing impatience, her foot tapping against the tile floor in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained frustration. "Personal calls are supposed to be made during your break," she said sharply, her voice carrying an edge of accusation. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that disrupts our entire operation." Marcus returned to his station, gently displacing Tony, who had been struggling to maintain the precise timing that the lunch rush demanded. "I'm sorry," Marcus said simply, his voice carrying no defensiveness, only quiet acknowledgement. "It won't happen again." But Karen wasn't finished. She followed Marcus to the grill, her voice rising to ensure that everyone in the kitchen could hear her criticism. "You think because you've been here longer than some of the others, you can just take personal calls whenever you want?" She continued, her tone growing more harsh with each word. "This is a business, not a social club." David felt his jaw tighten as he watched the scene unfold. In his years of managing restaurants, he had learned that true leadership meant protecting your staff, not humiliating them in front of their coworkers. The other employees were clearly uncomfortable, their eyes focused intently on their tasks while trying to avoid becoming targets themselves. Marcus absorbed the criticism without comment, his hands never pausing in their work. The burgers continued to flow from his station with perfect consistency, each one meeting the standards that had made this location profitable despite Karen's management style. There was something almost heroic in his quiet dignity, the way he maintained his professionalism even while being publicly dressed down. The phone call had clearly been about Emma, David realized. The careful way Marcus had spoken, the desperation hidden beneath his calm exterior, the mention of sessions that his daughter needed. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that made David's chest tight with a mixture of anger and admiration. As the lunch rush continued, David noticed how the other staff members responded to Marcus. They sought his guidance on complex orders, deferred to his judgment on timing and preparation, and seemed to relax when he was working nearby. It was the kind of natural authority that couldn't be taught or mandated, the respect that came from competence and character rather than position. But Karen seemed oblivious to these dynamics, or perhaps she resented them. She continued to find fault with Marcus's work throughout the afternoon, questioning decisions that were clearly correct and criticizing methods that were producing superior results. It was as if she had identified him as a threat to her authority and was determined to diminish him at every opportunity. During a brief lull between the lunch and dinner rushes, David found himself working alongside Marcus at the prep station. The man's knife skills were exceptional, his cuts precise and uniform in a way that spoke of formal training and years of practice. This was not the work of someone who had learned to cook in fast food kitchens. "You're really good at this," David said carefully, testing the waters. "Have you worked in restaurants for a long time?" Marcus's smile was brief but genuine. "I've been around food service for a while," he replied, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to keep his history private. "You pick things up over time." The deflection was polite but firm, and David recognized the boundaries that Marcus had established around his personal story. There were clearly chapters in this man's life that he wasn't ready to share, experiences that had shaped him in ways that went far beyond his current circumstances. As the afternoon wore on, David began to understand that he was witnessing something remarkable. Marcus Chen was not just surviving in a difficult situation, he was maintaining his dignity and professionalism in the face of treatment that would have broken many people. The tears David had witnessed earlier were not signs of weakness but evidence of the tremendous pressure this man carried every single day. The revelation was both humbling and infuriating. David had built his empire on the belief that hard work and dedication would be rewarded, that talent would rise to the surface and be recognized. But here was a man whose obvious capabilities were being not just ignored but actively suppressed by a manager who seemed threatened by his very competence. As his second day of investigation drew to a close, David knew that his understanding of his own company was about to change forever. The numbers and reports that had painted this location as underperforming had missed the most important story of all, the quiet heroism of a man who showed up every day to do his best work, not for recognition or advancement, but for the love of a little girl who needed him to be strong. The clock on the kitchen wall showed 8:15 when the official shift ended, but Marcus remained at his station, methodically cleaning equipment that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The other staff members had clocked out promptly, eager to return to their evening plans, but Marcus moved with the careful attention of someone who understood that tomorrow's success depended on tonight's preparation. David lingered near the time clock, pretending to review his training materials while observing Marcus's post-shift routine. The man worked with the same precision he brought to cooking, ensuring that every surface was spotless and every piece of equipment was properly maintained. It was the kind of dedication that went far beyond job requirements, the behavior of someone who took personal pride in his work regardless of recognition. Tony approached Marcus with a clipboard in hand, his expression mixing gratitude with concern. "Hey Marcus, I hate to ask, but could you help me with the inventory count? Karen wants it done tonight, and I'm running behind on the prep for tomorrow's delivery." Marcus looked up from the grill he was cleaning, his tired eyes softening with understanding. "Of course," he said simply, setting down his cleaning cloth. "What do you need me to check?" The inventory process revealed another layer of Marcus's capabilities. He moved through the storage areas with the confidence of someone who understood restaurant operations from the ground up, checking expiration dates, noting supply levels, and identifying potential waste issues with an efficiency that impressed David. This wasn't the work of a line cook following instructions, this was the systematic approach of someone with management experience. As they worked together, Tony's conversation provided glimpses into the restaurant's operational challenges. The delivery schedules were inconsistent, the storage systems were poorly organized, and the waste tracking was almost non-existent. Marcus listened to each concern with the focused attention of someone who understood the broader implications of these seemingly small problems. "You know," Tony said quietly, glancing toward Karen's closed office door, "this place ran a lot smoother when you were helping with the scheduling. I don't understand why Karen stopped letting you handle the staff assignments." Marcus's expression remained carefully neutral, but David caught the flash of pain that crossed his features. "She has her reasons," Marcus replied diplomatically. "I'm here to cook, not to manage." But the way Marcus organized the inventory sheets, the efficiency with which he streamlined their counting process, and the natural authority he exercised even in this supporting role told a different story. David found himself wondering what circumstances had brought a man with such obvious management skills to accept a position where his abilities were not just underutilized but actively suppressed. The inventory work stretched past 9 o'clock, but Marcus never complained about the unpaid overtime. He approached each task with the same methodical care he brought to cooking, ensuring accuracy and completeness even as the hour grew later. When Tony offered to finish the remaining sections alone, Marcus simply smiled and continued working. "I don't have anywhere else to be," Marcus said quietly, a statement that carried more weight than he probably intended. The admission revealed the isolation that surrounded his life outside of work, the absence of social obligations or personal relationships that might compete with his dedication to providing for Emma. David's phone buzzed with a text message from his personal assistant, reminding him of a dinner meeting with investors that he had completely forgotten. The contrast between his own full social calendar and Marcus's quiet admission struck him with unexpected force. While David juggled multiple commitments and social obligations, Marcus's entire world seemed to revolve around work and his daughter. As they completed the inventory, Marcus's expertise became even more apparent. He identified several discrepancies in the ordering patterns, suggested more efficient storage arrangements, and quietly corrected calculation errors that Tony had made. Each contribution was offered with humility, framed as suggestions rather than corrections, but the depth of knowledge behind them was unmistakable. The final task was checking the walk-in cooler, where Marcus immediately noticed a temperature fluctuation that Tony had missed. The unit was running slightly warm, a problem that could lead to food safety issues and significant waste if not addressed promptly. Marcus spent 20 minutes troubleshooting the system, his understanding of restaurant equipment evident in every adjustment he made. "This should hold until morning," Marcus said, wiping his hands on a towel, "but you'll want to call the repair service first thing. The compressor is working too hard, and the evaporator coils need cleaning." Tony stared at the temperature gauge, which now showed a steady reading in the safe zone. "How did you know how to fix that?" he asked, genuine admiration in his voice. "I was about to call emergency service." Marcus shrugged, the gesture carrying a weight of experience he didn't elaborate on. "You pick things up over time," he said, echoing his earlier deflection. "Equipment breaks down everywhere." As they finally prepared to leave, David noticed Marcus carefully counting a small stack of bills from his pocket. The man's expression was troubled as he folded the money away, clearly running calculations in his head that weren't yielding the results he needed. The rent deadline was approaching, and even with the overtime hours he worked without compensation, Marcus was still falling short. The parking lot was nearly empty when they emerged into the cool evening air. Tony climbed into his car with a grateful wave, but Marcus began walking toward the street, his shoulders set with the resigned determination of someone facing another long journey home. The 2-meal walk that saved bus fare was a daily reality that David was only beginning to understand. On impulse, David called out, offering Marcus a ride home. The man's hesitation was brief but telling, the automatic wariness of someone who had learned to be cautious about accepting help. When he finally accepted, settling into the passenger seat with careful politeness, David realized he was about to see another piece of Marcus's carefully guarded world. The address Marcus provided led to a complex of subsidized housing units, their weathered facades speaking of budget stretched thin and maintenance deferred. The playground equipment was worn but clean, and small gardens beside some units showed the efforts of residents who took pride in their homes despite limited resources. It was a community of people making the best of difficult circumstances, and Marcus clearly belonged here. "Thank you for the ride," Marcus said as they pulled up to his building. "And thank you for helping with the inventory. Tony appreciates having someone reliable to work with." The gratitude in his voice was genuine, but David sensed the careful distance Marcus maintained even in moments of kindness. This was a man who had learned to be self-sufficient, who accepted help reluctantly and offered it freely. As Marcus walked toward his building, David realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to understand the remarkable person hidden behind the humble exterior of a fast food cook who was so much more than he appeared to be. The industrial-sized freezer unit chose the worst possible moment to malfunction, its compressor grinding to a halt with a mechanical wheeze that echoed through the kitchen during the morning prep rush. Steam began rising from the unit as the temperature climbed steadily, threatening hundreds of dollars worth of frozen inventory that Richardson Burger couldn't afford to lose. Karen's reaction was swift and predictable. She emerged from her office with the frantic energy of someone whose bonus depended on controlling costs, her voice rising above the kitchen noise as she surveyed the situation. "This is exactly what we don't need right now," she announced to no one in particular, her hands gesturing wildly at the malfunctioning unit. "The repair service won't be here until this afternoon, and we'll lose everything if we can't get this fixed." The kitchen staff gathered around the freezer with the helpless fascination of people watching a disaster unfold. Tony was already on the phone with the repair company, his voice growing more frustrated as he navigated their automated system. The morning delivery was due in an hour, and without functioning freezer space, they would have nowhere to store the incoming inventory. Marcus stepped forward from his prep station, wiping his hands on his apron as he approached the malfunctioning unit. The sound it was making suggested a specific type of mechanical failure, one he had encountered before in his previous life when equipment problems could shut down entire operations. "May I take a look?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the careful deference he had learned to use when offering expertise that exceeded his job description. Karen's expression was skeptical but desperate. "Do you know something about freezer repair?" she asked, her tone mixing hope with the assumption that Marcus was probably overestimating his abilities. "I might be able to help," Marcus replied, already kneeling beside the unit to examine the external components. The compressor housing was hot to the touch, and the condenser coils were thick with accumulated dust and grease. These symptoms pointed to a relatively simple problem that could be addressed without waiting for professional service. Marcus worked with the methodical precision of someone who understood commercial kitchen equipment from years of hands-on experience. He located the electrical panel and shut off power to the unit, then began the systematic process of accessing the condenser coils. His movements were confident and efficient, each step taken with the assurance of someone who had performed similar repairs many times before. The other staff members watched with growing amazement as Marcus transformed from line cook to equipment technician. He removed the protective housing with practiced ease, exposing the mechanical components that most people would find intimidating. The condenser coils were indeed clogged with debris, and the evaporator fan was struggling to circulate air through the restricted passages. "This is mostly a maintenance issue," Marcus explained as he worked, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone accustomed to training others. "The coils need cleaning, and the fan motor needs lubrication. The compressor itself is probably fine, just overworked because it can't dissipate heat properly." Karen stood nearby, her expression shifting from skepticism to cautious optimism as Marcus methodically addressed each component. Tony had abandoned his phone call to the repair service, instead watching the impromptu repair session with the fascination of someone learning skills he never expected to need. Marcus requested basic cleaning supplies and tools, materials that were readily available in the restaurant's maintenance closet. He worked with the quiet concentration of someone who understood that lives and livelihoods depended on keeping equipment running. Each component was cleaned thoroughly, lubricated where necessary, and carefully reassembled according to proper specifications. The moment of truth came when Marcus restored power to the unit. The compressor started with a healthy hum, free from the grinding noise that had signaled its distress. The temperature gauge began dropping steadily, and the steam that had been rising from the unit gradually dissipated. Within minutes, the freezer was functioning normally again, its mechanical heartbeat strong and steady. The kitchen erupted in spontaneous applause, with staff members expressing amazement at Marcus's unexpected expertise. Tony clapped him on the shoulder with genuine admiration, while the other cooks gathered around to examine the work that had just saved their day. Even Karen seemed impressed, though she struggled to reconcile Marcus's demonstrated capabilities with her preconceived notions about his role and abilities. "Where did you learn to do that?" Tony asked, his voice filled with the respect accorded to someone who had just performed what seemed like magic. "I mean, that was like watching a professional repair technician work." Marcus's response was characteristically modest. "You pick things up when you work in restaurants for a while," he said, deflecting attention from his obvious expertise. "Equipment breaks down everywhere, and sometimes you can't wait for help to arrive." But David, watching from his position near the prep station, understood that this was far more than casual knowledge accumulated over time. Marcus's systematic approach, his understanding of commercial equipment specifications, and his confidence in performing complex repairs spoke of formal training and extensive experience. This was the work of someone who had once been responsible for maintaining entire restaurant operations. As the morning continued, David noticed how the other staff members' attitudes toward Marcus had shifted. They sought his opinion on other equipment issues, deferred to his judgment on maintenance schedules, and treated him with the respect typically reserved for skilled professionals. The freezer repair had revealed capabilities that couldn't be hidden or dismissed. Karen's reaction was more complex. While she couldn't deny the value of Marcus's intervention, she seemed uncomfortable with the way it had elevated his status among the staff. The natural authority he had always possessed was now reinforced by demonstrated expertise, creating a dynamic that challenged her official position as manager. What part of this story resonates most with you? Have you ever worked alongside someone whose talents seemed hidden beneath their job title? Share your thoughts about the people who surprise us with their capabilities. The lunch rush proceeded smoothly, with the repaired freezer functioning perfectly and the kitchen staff working with renewed confidence. Marcus returned to his usual duties at the grill, but there was a subtle change in the atmosphere. His colleagues looked at him differently now, with an awareness that there was more to their quiet coworker than they had previously understood. David found himself re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about talent recognition and employee development. How many Marcus Chens were working in his restaurants, their abilities unrecognized and underutilized? How many potential leaders were being overlooked because they didn't fit the conventional image of management material? As the afternoon progressed, David realized that the freezer repair had been more than just a mechanical fix. It had been a revelation that challenged assumptions about worth and capability, about the hidden talents that existed in plain sight. Marcus Chen was not just surviving in a difficult situation, he was demonstrating the kind of practical intelligence and problem-solving ability that made great leaders. The question now was what Karen would do with this new understanding of Marcus's capabilities, and whether she would recognize the asset that had been working under her supervision all along. The employee break room was a cramped space behind the kitchen, furnished with mismatched chairs and a small table that had seen better days. It was here that Marcus and Tony found themselves during the quiet lull between lunch and dinner service, sharing a moment of honest conversation that David happened to overhear from the adjacent hallway. Marcus sat with his usual quiet dignity, but the weight of his concerns was evident in the way his shoulders curved slightly forward, as if he were carrying an invisible burden. Tony had brought 2 cups of coffee from the machine, the kind of small gesture that spoke of genuine friendship between co-workers who had learned to support each other through difficult circumstances. "I keep thinking about what you did with that freezer this morning," Tony said, settling into the chair across from Marcus. "That wasn't something you just picked up from watching repair guys work. You knew exactly what you were doing, like you'd been trained for it. Marcus's smile was brief but genuine, touched with the sadness of someone remembering a different version of himself. I used to manage 3 restaurants for a regional chain, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a confession that had been held too long. Back then, I had to understand everything about operations. Equipment maintenance, staff scheduling, inventory management, food safety protocols. You learn to fix things because you can't afford to wait for help. Tony's expression shifted to one of amazement mixed with confusion. You were a regional manager? He asked, struggling to reconcile this revelation with the humble line cook he had worked alongside for months. What happened? I mean, if you don't mind me asking. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken pain. Marcus stared into his coffee cup as if the dark liquid might contain answers to questions he had been asking himself for years. My daughter was in a car accident, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. She was in the hospital for months, and I spent every moment I could with her. The company was understanding at first, but eventually they needed someone who could travel, someone who could be available for emergencies. David found himself holding his breath, understanding that he was witnessing a moment of vulnerability that Marcus rarely allowed himself to show. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, painting a picture of sacrifice and loss that explained so much about the man's current circumstances. The medical bills were enormous, Marcus continued, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup as if seeking its warmth. Even with insurance, there were specialists, experimental treatments, equipment that might help her walk again. I used everything I had, sold everything I owned, and when that wasn't enough, I borrowed against my retirement, my savings, everything. Tony listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that he was being trusted with a story that defined another person's life. His own expression reflected the kind of empathy that comes from recognizing pain in someone you respect and care about. When the treatments didn't work, Marcus said, his voice growing even quieter, I had to accept that Emma would need a wheelchair for the rest of her life. But she was alive, and she was still my little girl, and that was all that mattered. The company offered me a lower position, but it would have meant relocating to a city where I didn't know anyone, where Emma wouldn't have the support system she needed. So you chose to stay here, Tony said, understanding dawning in his voice. You chose her over your career. Marcus's nod was almost imperceptible. I took the first job I could find that would let me be home every night, that would give me the flexibility to take her to appointments and be there when she needed me. The pay was a fraction of what I was making before, but it was enough to survive, and surviving was all I could think about. The conversation revealed the depth of Marcus's sacrifice in a way that made David's chest tighten with emotion. This wasn't just a story about career setbacks or financial hardship, it was a testament to the lengths a parent would go to protect their child, regardless of the personal cost. She's everything to me, Marcus said, his voice strengthening with the fierce love that had driven every decision he had made. Every morning when I help her get ready for school, every evening when we talk about her day, every time she smiles at me like I'm her hero, I know I made the right choice. She doesn't remember the big house or the fancy car or the executive title. She just knows that Daddy is always there when she needs him. Tony reached across the table and gripped Marcus's shoulder, the gesture carrying all the words that didn't need to be spoken. But don't you ever wonder what might have been different? He asked gently. Don't you ever wish you could use those skills again? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the careful thought he brought to everything in his life. Sometimes I think about it, he admitted. When I see problems that could be solved, processes that could be improved, people who could be developed into leaders. But then I remember that Emma needs me to be reliable, to be present, to be the constant in her life that she can count on. That's worth more than any title or salary. The break room door opened, and Karen's voice cut through the intimate atmosphere like a blade. Break time is over, she announced, her tone carrying the usual edge of impatience. We have prep work to finish before the dinner rush, and I need everyone back at their stations. Marcus stood immediately, his professional demeanor sliding back into place like armor. The vulnerable moment was over, replaced by the quiet competence that had become his trademark. But Tony remained seated for a moment longer, his expression reflecting the new understanding he had gained about the man he had worked alongside for so long. As they returned to their duties, David found himself struggling to process what he had witnessed. Marcus Chen wasn't just a skilled worker who had been unfairly overlooked, he was a former executive who had voluntarily stepped away from success to care for his disabled daughter. The magnitude of that sacrifice, and the grace with which he had accepted his reduced circumstances, challenged everything David thought he knew about ambition and success. The dinner service that followed was routine in its efficiency, but David saw everything differently now. Marcus's natural leadership wasn't just talent waiting to be recognized, it was experience and expertise that had been temporarily set aside for something more important. The man who guided the kitchen through its busiest periods with quiet authority had once commanded much larger operations, making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. As the evening wore on, David realized that his investigation had uncovered something far more significant than operational inefficiencies or management problems. He had discovered a story about love, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism of a father who had redefined success in terms of his daughter's well-being rather than his own professional advancement. The Saturday evening rush descended on Richardson Burger with the intensity of a perfect storm, orders flowing faster than the kitchen had seen in months. A nearby movie theater had just released its evening shows, and families flooded the restaurant with the urgent hunger of people who had spent 3 hours watching superheroes save the world. The kitchen transformed into a battlefield of controlled chaos, with every station pushed to its absolute limit. Marcus moved through the mayhem with the fluid grace of someone who had orchestrated similar scenes countless times before. Without being asked, he began coordinating the flow of orders, his voice calm and steady as he guided the overwhelmed staff through the mounting pressure. He called out timing adjustments, redirected resources to bottlenecked stations, and maintained quality standards even as the pace threatened to overwhelm their systems. David watched in fascination as Marcus's true nature emerged under pressure. The humble line cook disappeared, replaced by the regional manager he had once been. His movements were decisive, his instructions clear and precise, and his presence somehow made the entire operation run smoother. The other staff members responded to his guidance instinctively, recognizing authentic leadership when they saw it. "We're falling behind on the chicken sandwiches," Marcus called out to the prep station, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex operations. "Sarah, can you drop another batch of tenders? Tony, let's move those completed orders to the warming station and clear some space for the next round." The coordination was masterful, a display of operational expertise that went far beyond anything a line cook should possess. Marcus had unconsciously assumed command of the entire kitchen, and the remarkable thing was that everyone seemed to welcome his leadership. The chaos began to resolve into efficient productivity, with orders flowing out at a pace that kept the growing crowd of customers satisfied. Karen emerged from the dining area where she had been dealing with increasingly impatient customers, her face flushed with the stress of managing complaints and long wait times. The sight that greeted her in the kitchen stopped her in her tracks. Marcus was directing the operation with quiet confidence, his natural authority evident in every gesture and decision. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Karen's voice cut through the kitchen noise like a knife, her tone sharp with indignation. "You're a line cook, not a manager. Get back to your station and stop trying to run my kitchen." The entire kitchen fell silent, the efficient coordination grinding to a halt as everyone turned to witness the confrontation. Marcus's face showed no anger, only the patient dignity of someone who had learned to accept criticism gracefully. He nodded once and returned to his grill station, but the damage was done. Without his coordination, the kitchen began to fall behind again. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying across the suddenly tense atmosphere. "I was just trying to help keep us on track." Karen's response was swift and public, designed to reassert her authority in front of the entire staff. "I don't need help from someone who can't even follow basic instructions about staying in his lane," she announced, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're here to cook burgers, not to play manager. If you can't handle that simple job description, maybe you need to find work somewhere else." The cruelty of the public humiliation was breathtaking. David felt his hands clench into fists as he watched Marcus absorb the verbal assault with quiet dignity. The man who had just demonstrated exceptional leadership capabilities was being dressed down like a child, his expertise dismissed and his character attacked in front of his colleagues. But the most remarkable thing was how Marcus responded. He didn't defend himself or point out the obvious improvements his leadership had brought to the operation. Instead, he simply nodded and returned to his work, his movements careful and precise as he focused on the tasks Karen had assigned him. The grace with which he accepted the unfair treatment was both inspiring and heartbreaking. The dinner rush continued, but without Marcus's coordination, the kitchen struggled to maintain its previous efficiency. Orders backed up, wait times increased, and the quality of food began to suffer as stressed staff members made mistakes under pressure. Karen seemed oblivious to the deteriorating performance, focused instead on maintaining her authority over the operation. David found himself torn between admiration for Marcus's dignity and fury at the injustice of the situation. This was a man who had once managed multi-million-dollar operations, who had demonstrated exceptional leadership skills under pressure, and who was being treated like an incompetent subordinate by someone who clearly didn't understand the first thing about effective management. Have you ever watched someone with obvious talent being held back by circumstances beyond their control? What would you do if you witnessed this kind of treatment in your workplace? Sometimes the most powerful response is simply recognizing the worth in people that others choose to overlook. As the evening progressed, the contrast between Marcus's capabilities and Karen's management style became even more apparent. While Marcus quietly solved problems and maintained standards, Karen created tension and confusion with her micromanagement and harsh criticism. The staff members looked increasingly stressed and demoralized, their earlier confidence shattered by the hostile atmosphere. During a brief lull, David noticed Marcus step outside for what appeared to be his dinner break. Through the window, he could see the man sitting alone on the same crate where he had witnessed the tears just days before. But tonight, Marcus wasn't crying. He was simply sitting in quiet contemplation, his shoulders straight and his dignity intact despite the public humiliation he had endured. The sight crystallized something in David's mind. This wasn't just about operational efficiency or management problems anymore. This was about human dignity, about the way people deserve to be treated regardless of their position or circumstances. Marcus Chen represented everything that was right about dedication and professionalism, while Karen Mills embodied the kind of toxic management that destroyed morale and wasted human potential. As the restaurant prepared for closing, David made a decision that would change everything. He had seen enough, learned enough, and understood enough about the real dynamics of this location. The investigation was over, but the real work was just beginning. Tomorrow, Marcus Chen would discover that sometimes dignity and perseverance are recognized by the people who matter most. The evening ended with the usual cleaning routines, but the atmosphere remained tense from the earlier confrontation. Marcus worked with his characteristic thoroughness, ensuring that every surface was spotless and every piece of equipment was properly maintained. He showed no resentment toward Karen, no bitterness about the public humiliation, only the quiet professionalism that had defined his approach to every challenge. As David prepared to leave, he realized that he had witnessed something extraordinary. In Marcus Chen, he had found not just a skilled employee, but a man whose character had been tested by adversity and emerged stronger. The question now was whether David could create an opportunity worthy of such exceptional qualities, and whether he could right the wrongs that had kept this remarkable person hidden in plain sight. The 15-minute break that Marcus took after the dinner rush was a sacred ritual of survival, a brief respite from the relentless pace that had defined his days for the past 2 years. He sat on the familiar crate behind the restaurant, his uniform still damp with perspiration from the intensity of the evening service, and carefully counted the small collection of bills and coins that represented his day's earnings. $3.47 in tips. The meager sum felt heavy in his hands, weighted with the knowledge that it represented hours of skilled work and quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation. Marcus spread the money on his palm, calculating and recalculating the totals that never seemed to add up to enough. Rent was due in 2 days, and he was still $36 short despite working every available hour. The tears came without warning, silent drops that traced paths down his cheeks as the accumulated stress of weeks and months finally found release. Marcus had learned to cry quietly, to let the emotion flow without sound or drama, a skill developed during those long nights in hospital corridors when Emma's future hung in the balance and his own world crumbled around him. David stood in the shadows near the back door, struggling with the ethical implications of witnessing such a private moment. Every instinct told him to retreat, to allow Marcus the dignity of his solitude, but something deeper compelled him to stay. This was the reality behind the professional facade, the human cost of circumstances that had reduced a capable leader to counting pocket change and hoping it would be enough. The phone call that interrupted Marcus's tears was brief but devastating. Marcus answered with the careful composure he maintained even in his most vulnerable moments, his voice steady despite the evidence of emotion on his face. The conversation was one-sided from David's perspective, but Marcus's responses painted a clear picture of the crisis unfolding. "I understand the policy," Marcus said quietly into the phone, his free hand wiping away the traces of tears. "But she's been making real progress with the exercises. The therapist says she's stronger than she's been in months." The pause that followed seemed to stretch forever, filled with the weight of desperate hope being crushed by bureaucratic indifference. "No, I don't have it today," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I know it's been overdue for 3 weeks. I'm trying to find the money, but with the rent due and the medication costs, I just need a little more time." The response from the other end was clearly negative, because Marcus's shoulders sagged with the defeat of someone who had exhausted every option. "Please don't cancel her sessions," Marcus said, and David could hear the quiet desperation that he tried so hard to keep hidden. "She looks forward to them. They're the only thing that gives her hope that maybe someday she might walk again. I'll find the money somehow. I promise I'll find it." When the call ended, Marcus sat in silence for several minutes, his head bowed as if the weight of his circumstances had become too much to bear. The tears returned, but they were different now, tinged with the particular anguish of a parent who couldn't provide for his child's most basic needs. This wasn't just about money, it was about hope, about the dreams that kept a little girl motivated to work through painful exercises and endless disappointments. David found himself fighting his own emotions as he watched this display of raw human suffering. The man who had just demonstrated exceptional leadership skills, who had improved the efficiency of an entire kitchen operation, was sitting alone in the darkness counting tips that wouldn't be enough to pay for his daughter's medical care. The injustice of it felt like a physical blow. Marcus pulled out a small notebook, its pages worn soft from constant handling, and began making calculations with the stub of a pencil. David could see him working through various scenarios, trying different combinations of bill priorities and payment delays, searching for a solution that would allow him to keep Emma's physical therapy appointments. The mathematical reality was unforgiving, but Marcus continued calculating with the desperate persistence of someone who refused to accept defeat. After several minutes of futile arithmetic, Marcus put the notebook away and sat in contemplative silence. When he finally stood to return to work, his movements carried the weight of someone who had accepted that tomorrow would bring the same impossible choices, the same careful balance between dignity and desperation that had defined his life since Emma's accident. David waited until Marcus had disappeared back into the restaurant before emerging from the shadows. The scene he had witnessed would haunt him for the rest of his life, not just because of the immediate suffering it revealed, but because of what it said about the systems and circumstances that could reduce a man of such obvious worth to such desperate straits. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of routine tasks and careful observations. Marcus returned to his duties with the same quiet professionalism he had maintained throughout the week, showing no trace of the emotional crisis David had witnessed. The man's ability to compartmentalize his personal struggles and maintain his work performance was itself a testament to his character and strength. As closing time approached, David made a decision that would change everything. He had come here to investigate operational problems, but he had discovered something far more significant. The real issue wasn't efficiency or management structure, it was the human cost of circumstances that prevented good people from reaching their potential. Marcus Chen deserved better than counting tips and choosing between rent and his daughter's medical care. The walk to Marcus's apartment complex took David through neighborhoods he had never seen despite living in the same city for years. The contrast between his gated community and these modest streets was stark, but what struck him most was the evidence of community and care that existed here. Small gardens, children's toys carefully stored on porches, neighbors greeting each other with genuine warmth. This wasn't just where Marcus lived, it was where he belonged, where Emma had friends and support systems that money couldn't buy. David parked across the street from Marcus's building and watched as the man climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment. Through a window, he could see the warm glow of lights being turned on, and moments later, the silhouette of a small girl in a wheelchair being embraced by her father. The simple scene of reunion and love was more powerful than any corporate presentation or profit report David had ever witnessed. The decision that had been building throughout the week crystallized in that moment. David Richardson had the power to change Marcus Chen's life, to restore him to a position where his talents could flourish and his daughter could receive the care she needed. More importantly, he had the moral obligation to act on what he had learned about dignity, sacrifice, and the hidden potential that existed in the most unlikely places. As David drove back to his own world of luxury and privilege, he knew that tomorrow would bring revelations that would shock everyone involved. But tonight, he simply carried the image of a father embracing his daughter, two people who had found strength in each other despite circumstances that would have broken many others. That strength would soon be rewarded in ways that neither of them could possibly imagine. The Monday morning shift began like any other, with Marcus arriving precisely on time and moving through his opening routine with the methodical precision that had become his trademark. The weekend had been difficult, with Emma asking quiet questions about why her therapy sessions had been cancelled and Marcus struggling to find words that would preserve her hope while acknowledging their harsh reality. David watched from his position at the prep station, noting the subtle signs of strain in Marcus's demeanor. The man's professional facade remained intact, but there was a heaviness in his movements that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. The medication costs for Emma's condition had forced him to choose between physical therapy and pain management, and the weight of that choice was evident in every careful gesture. The morning rush proceeded with its usual intensity, but the kitchen dynamics had shifted since Saturday's confrontation. The staff members seemed more subdued, their earlier confidence shaken by witnessing Karen's public humiliation of Marcus. They still looked to him for guidance, but now they did so with furtive glances and whispered questions, afraid to be seen acknowledging his natural authority. Karen's mood had grown increasingly volatile over the weekend, her frustration with the restaurant's performance manifesting in sharper criticism and more frequent interventions. She prowled the kitchen like a predator seeking weakness, her clipboard clutched like a weapon as she documented every minor deviation from her rigid standards. The atmosphere had become toxic, with staff members walking on eggshells and productivity suffering under the weight of fear and resentment. The incident that would change everything began with something as simple as a dropped spatula. Marcus was managing 3 orders simultaneously when the utensil slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor with a metallic ring that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet kitchen. It was the kind of minor accident that happened dozens of times each day, requiring nothing more than a quick cleanup and replacement tool. But Karen seized on the moment with the fury of someone who had been waiting for an excuse to assert her dominance. "That's exactly the kind of carelessness that's been plaguing this location," she announced, her voice rising to ensure everyone could hear. "You can't even hold on to basic equipment, and you think you're qualified to tell other people how to do their jobs?" Marcus bent to retrieve the spatula, his movements careful and deliberate as he disposed of it properly and reached for a clean replacement. "I apologize," he said quietly, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had learned to accept criticism gracefully. "It won't happen again." Karen's response was swift and devastating. "Oh, it definitely won't happen again," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "You're fired. Clear out your locker and get off my property. I'm tired of your attitude and your constant undermining of my authority." The kitchen fell into stunned silence. The other staff members stared in disbelief, their faces reflecting the shock of witnessing such a disproportionate response to a minor accident. Tony stepped forward as if to protest, but Karen's glare silenced him before he could speak. Even the customers in the dining area seemed to sense the tension, their conversations dropping to whispers as the confrontation played out. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, the clean spatula still in his hand as he processed what had just happened. The job that had provided his only source of income, meager as it was, had just been eliminated over a dropped utensil. The implications crashed over him like a wave. No income meant no rent money, no medication for Emma, and no hope of resuming her physical therapy sessions. "I understand," Marcus said finally, his voice steady despite the devastation of the moment. "I'll clean out my station and be gone within the hour." The dignity with which he accepted his termination was breathtaking. There was no anger, no pleading, no attempt to argue the unfairness of the situation. Marcus simply nodded once and began the process of transferring his responsibilities to his shocked co-workers, ensuring that the kitchen would continue to function smoothly even without his presence. David felt something snap inside him as he watched this final injustice unfold. The week of observation had shown him everything he needed to know about the real dynamics of this location, about the waste of human potential that occurred when toxic management destroyed good people. The time for passive observation had ended. "Actually," David said, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere with quiet authority, "I don't think Marcus will be going anywhere." Karen spun around to face him, her expression mixing confusion with irritation. "Excuse me?" she snapped. "I don't know who you think you are, but you have no authority here. This is my restaurant, and I'll terminate anyone I choose." David reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, extending it toward Karen with the calm confidence of someone who had just decided to stop pretending. "You're absolutely right," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had been hidden behind his humble disguise. "This is your restaurant. But I own the entire chain." The silence that followed was absolute. Karen stared at the business card as if it were written in a foreign language, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. The other staff members stood frozen, their eyes moving between David and Karen as they tried to process this impossible revelation. "My name is David Richardson," he continued, his voice steady and professional. "I've been working undercover for the past week, investigating reports of poor performance at this location. What I've discovered is that the performance problems have nothing to do with the staff and everything to do with management that doesn't recognize talent when it's standing right in front of them." Marcus's expression was unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on David with a mixture of shock and something that might have been hope. The man who had accepted his termination with quiet dignity was now watching as the entire foundation of his understanding shifted beneath his feet. Karen's voice, when she finally found it, was barely a whisper. "You're really David Richardson?" she asked, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. "The CEO of Richardson Burger?" David nodded, his attention already shifting away from Karen toward the man who had impressed him beyond measure. "Marcus," he said, his voice carrying genuine respect, "I'd like to offer you a position that actually matches your capabilities. How would you feel about becoming the regional manager for our Eastern District?" The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands gripping the edge of the prep counter as he tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. In the space of 5 minutes, he had gone from unemployed to offered a position that would transform his and Emma's lives forever. The kitchen remained frozen in that moment of revelation, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The quiet man who had been dismissed and undervalued was being offered recognition and opportunity by the most powerful person in the company. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived at Richardson Burger on Maple Street. The silence that followed David's offer stretched like a held breath, with Marcus standing perfectly still as the magnitude of the moment settled over him. His hands trembled slightly as he processed the transformation of his circumstances, from unemployment to a regional management position that would change everything for himself and Emma. The other staff members watched in fascination, witnessing what felt like a fairy tale unfolding in their ordinary workplace. "I don't understand," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the careful caution of someone who had learned that hope could be dangerous. "You're offering me a management position? After what just happened?" David stepped closer, his expression mixing professional respect with personal admiration. "Marcus, I've spent the past week watching you work, and I've never seen anyone demonstrate such natural leadership under difficult circumstances. You have the skills, the experience, and most importantly, the character that makes exceptional leaders. The only question is whether you're willing to take the opportunity." Marcus's mind raced through the implications of the offer. A regional management position would mean a salary that could cover Emma's medical expenses, proper insurance coverage, and the financial security that had seemed impossible just moments before. But it would also mean responsibility, travel, and the possibility of failing in a role that demanded everything he had learned to hold in reserve. The hesitation in Marcus's expression was understandable to anyone who had ever faced the prospect of dramatic change. For 2 years, he had built his life around the simple goal of survival, of being present for Emma and providing the basic necessities that kept their small family intact. The idea of stepping back into the executive world that had once consumed his life was both thrilling and terrifying. "What about Emma?" Marcus asked, his voice revealing the core concern that drove every decision he made. "She needs me to be available, to take her to appointments, to be there when she has difficult days. I can't accept a position that would take me away from her." David's smile was warm with understanding. "Marcus, regional managers in our Eastern District work from home offices and set their own schedules. You would have the flexibility to be the father Emma needs while using your talents to improve our operations. We're not asking you to choose between your daughter and your career. We're asking you to excel at both." The offer was more generous than Marcus had dared to imagine, addressing his deepest concerns while providing opportunities that had seemed forever beyond his reach. But the years of disappointment and struggle had taught him to be wary of promises that seemed too good to be true. His expression remained cautious, protective of the hope that was beginning to bloom in his chest. Tony stepped forward, his face bright with excitement for his colleague. "Marcus, this is incredible," he said, his voice filled with genuine joy. "You deserve this. We all saw how you managed that kitchen, how you made everything work better. You're going to be amazing at this." The support from his co-workers was overwhelming. The other staff members nodded their agreement, their faces reflecting the satisfaction of seeing someone they respected finally receive the recognition he deserved. Even in the midst of his own shock, Marcus felt gratitude for these people who had worked alongside him and witnessed his capabilities firsthand. Karen stood frozen in the corner, her earlier authority completely evaporated as she watched her former subordinate being offered a position that far exceeded her own. The woman who had wielded her power so carelessly was now facing the consequences of her actions, her future with the company suddenly uncertain in the face of David's obvious disapproval. "I need to think about this," Marcus said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would affect not just his own future but Emma's as well. "This is a lot to process, and I want to make sure I can give you the commitment you deserve while being the father my daughter needs." David nodded with understanding. "Of course," he said, reaching into his wallet to pull out another business card. "Take all the time you need. But Marcus, I want you to know that this isn't charity or sympathy. This is recognition of your abilities and an investment in someone who can help our company become better. You've earned this opportunity." The business card felt heavy in Marcus's hand, weighted with possibilities that extended far beyond his current circumstances. Regional Manager, Eastern District, Richardson Burger Corporation. The title that had once seemed like an impossible dream was now within his grasp, offered by someone who had witnessed his capabilities firsthand. If this story has touched your heart, where in the world are you listening from right now? Have you ever seen someone's life change in an instant like this? Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them, when justice finally arrives for those who have waited patiently and worked with dignity. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with David outlining the specific responsibilities and benefits of the position while Marcus asked thoughtful questions about expectations and timelines. The discussion revealed the depth of Marcus's understanding of restaurant operations, his strategic thinking about market development, and his natural instinct for leadership that had been suppressed but never lost. As the immediate shock began to fade, Marcus found himself thinking about Emma's reaction to this news. She had never known him as anything other than the line cook who came home tired but devoted, who helped with homework and made simple dinners in their small kitchen. The idea of being able to provide her with opportunities they had only dreamed about was almost overwhelming. The regional management position would mean not just financial security, but the chance to use his skills in service of something larger than survival. Marcus had spent 2 years focusing on the immediate needs of each day, but now he could begin to think about the future, about Emma's education, about medical treatments that might help her, about the dreams they had both learned to keep carefully hidden. David's offer represented more than just a job, it was validation of Marcus's worth as a professional and recognition of the sacrifices he had made as a father. The man who had been dismissed and undervalued was being invited to step into a role where his talents could flourish and his dedication could be properly rewarded. As the conversation wound down, Marcus realized that his answer was already forming in his heart. The opportunity to provide for Emma while using his abilities to make a meaningful contribution was exactly what he had been hoping for without daring to believe it was possible. The regional management position represented not just a new beginning, but the chance to prove that his faith in hard work and integrity had been justified. The kitchen gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but the atmosphere had changed forever. Marcus Chen was no longer just a line cook who had been unfairly terminated, he was a respected professional who had been recognized by the highest authority in the company. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, for the first time in years, Marcus would go home with genuine hope for the future. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Marcus Chen approached Richardson Burger for what he knew would be his last day as a line cook. The business card in his pocket felt like a talisman, a tangible reminder that his life was about to change in ways he was still struggling to comprehend. He had spent the entire night talking with Emma, sharing the incredible news and watching her face light up with joy and amazement at her father's transformation. "Daddy, you're going to be a boss again," Emma had said, her voice filled with the pure excitement of a child who understood that miracles sometimes happen to good people. "And we can pay for my therapy, and maybe even see the ocean someday." The memory of her words gave Marcus strength as he entered the restaurant for his final shift. The other staff members greeted him with a mixture of respect and curiosity, everyone aware that something extraordinary had happened but unsure exactly what it meant for their daily routines. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath waiting for the next chapter to unfold. David was already there, no longer disguised as Dave the new employee but present as the CEO conducting official business. He wore a crisp suit and carried himself with the natural authority that had been hidden beneath his humble facade. The transformation was as dramatic as Marcus's own journey from dismissed line cook to regional manager designate. The morning brought an unexpected visitor that would change everything even more dramatically. A black sedan pulled into the parking lot, and from it emerged a woman in an expensive business suit whose presence immediately commanded attention. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to corporate boardrooms and high-stakes decisions. "Marcus," David said, approaching with the visitor in tow, "I'd like you to meet Jennifer Walsh, our Vice President of Operations. She's here to discuss the specifics of your new position and to witness something I think you'll find interesting." Jennifer's handshake was firm and professional, her eyes sharp with the assessment of someone who had built her career on recognizing talent and potential. "I've heard remarkable things about your abilities, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying genuine respect. "David has shared some very impressive observations about your work here." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced during his time as a line cook. Jennifer asked detailed questions about his operational philosophy, his approach to staff development, and his strategic thinking about market expansion. The discussion revealed the depth of his expertise while confirming that his capabilities matched the demands of the regional management position. But the real surprise came when Jennifer opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents and photographs. "We've been conducting a comprehensive review of our management practices," she explained, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Your situation here isn't unique, Marcus. We've discovered similar problems at 17 other locations where talented employees were being underutilized or mistreated by ineffective managers." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. The injustice he had experienced wasn't an isolated incident but part of a systemic problem that had affected dozens of other employees across the company. The waste of human potential was staggering, representing years of lost productivity and countless individuals whose talents had been suppressed or ignored. Jennifer continued, her voice growing more determined with each word. We're implementing immediate changes to our management structure and training programs, but we need experienced leaders who understand both the operational challenges and the human cost of poor management. That's why David's offer to you is so important. You're not just getting a job, you're becoming part of a transformation that will affect thousands of employees. The scope of the opportunity was overwhelming. Marcus had thought he was simply being offered a chance to rebuild his own career, but now he understood that he was being asked to help reform an entire corporate culture. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the potential to make a meaningful difference in the lives of people who faced the same challenges he had endured. Marcus felt a surge of purpose that he hadn't experienced since before Emma's accident. The regional management position wasn't just about financial security or professional advancement, it was about using his experience to ensure that other talented individuals wouldn't have to endure the kind of treatment he had received from Karen Mills. Speaking of which, Jennifer said, her tone shifting to one of official business, we need to address the management situation at this location. Karen Mills has been terminated, effective immediately. Tony Rodriguez will be promoted to general manager, and we're implementing new training protocols for all supervisory staff. The news of Karen's termination brought a collective sigh of relief from the kitchen staff who had gathered to witness the proceedings. Tony's promotion was met with genuine applause, recognition of his fairness and competence that had been overshadowed by Karen's toxic leadership style. The entire dynamic of the restaurant was shifting before their eyes. Marcus, Jennifer continued, your first assignment as regional manager will be to oversee the implementation of these changes at this location and 6 others in the Eastern District. You'll be working directly with our human resources team to identify and develop talent that may have been overlooked by previous management. The assignment was perfect, allowing Marcus to stay close to Emma while using his experience to help other employees who might be trapped in situations similar to his own. The work would be challenging but deeply meaningful, a chance to transform his personal struggles into tools for positive change. As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself naturally slipping into his new role. He reviewed operational reports with Jennifer, discussed staffing strategies with David, and provided input on policy changes that would affect hundreds of locations. The transition from line cook to regional manager was seamless, as if he had simply been waiting for the opportunity to use skills that had never disappeared. The other staff members watched in amazement as Marcus transformed before their eyes. The quiet man who had accepted criticism and abuse with dignity was now confidently discussing corporate strategy with senior executives. The respect in their eyes was unmistakable, recognition that they had been working alongside someone extraordinary without fully understanding his capabilities. Tony approached Marcus during a brief break, his face showing a mixture of gratitude and admiration. I always knew you were special, he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. But I never imagined this. You're going to change everything for people like us. The acknowledgement from his former co-worker was deeply moving. Marcus realized that his journey from executive to line cook and back to management had given him insights that few leaders possessed. He understood both the strategic demands of corporate leadership and the daily realities of frontline employees, a combination that would make him uniquely effective in his new role. As the day continued, Marcus began to envision the future with clarity and purpose. Emma would receive the medical care she needed, they would have financial security, and he would have the opportunity to use his talents in service of something larger than survival. The regional management position represented not just personal redemption but the chance to ensure that other families wouldn't have to face the impossible choices that had defined his life for the past 2 years. The transformation was complete, but Marcus understood that this was not an ending but a beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference in the lives of employees who deserved better than they had received. The quiet dignity that had sustained him through his darkest hours would now become the foundation for leadership that could change an entire corporate culture. 3 months later, Marcus Chen stood in the gleaming conference room of Richardson Berger's regional headquarters, presenting his quarterly report to a room full of executives who listened with the kind of attention reserved for someone who had delivered extraordinary results. The transformation of his assigned locations had exceeded every expectation, with employee satisfaction scores rising dramatically and operational efficiency reaching levels that had previously seemed impossible. The man who had once counted tips in a restaurant parking lot now commanded respect from corporate leaders who recognized his unique ability to identify and develop talent. His reports weren't just filled with numbers and statistics, they told stories of individuals whose capabilities had been unleashed when given proper recognition and opportunity. At the Richardson Burger on Maple Street, Tony Rodriguez had flourished as general manager, implementing the collaborative leadership style he had learned from watching Marcus work. The restaurant that had once been plagued by high turnover and low morale now served as a model location, with employees who took pride in their work and customers who noticed the difference in service quality. The afternoon brought Marcus to his favorite part of each day, the drive home to Emma. The modest apartment had been replaced by a comfortable house in a neighborhood with good schools and accessible facilities, but more importantly, it was filled with the sounds of a child who had reasons to be excited about the future. Emma's physical therapy sessions had resumed with intensive treatments that were showing remarkable progress, and her laughter echoed through rooms that no longer carried the weight of financial desperation. "Daddy," Emma called from her position at the kitchen table where she was working on homework, "Mrs. Patterson says I might be able to try walking with the new braces next month. She thinks I'm strong enough now." The hope in her voice was the most beautiful sound Marcus had ever heard. The experimental treatments and advanced physical therapy that his new position had made possible were giving Emma opportunities that had seemed impossible just a few months before. The little girl who had dreamed of building sandcastles by the ocean was now making plans that included the possibility of walking on the beach. Marcus knelt beside her wheelchair, marveling at the strength and determination that had carried her through years of challenges. "You've been working so hard, little star," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of how brave you've been." Emma's smile was radiant with the joy of a child who understood that her father's love had never wavered, even during their darkest days. But now there was something else in her expression, a confidence that came from knowing that dreams could come true when good people worked hard and never gave up hope. The evening brought a video call from David Richardson, who had become not just Marcus's employer but a genuine friend. The CEO's face appeared on the laptop screen, his expression warm with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice being served in the most meaningful way possible. "Marcus, I wanted to share some news with you," David said, his voice carrying the excitement of someone about to deliver wonderful information. "The board has approved the expansion of our talent development program to all company locations. Your success in the Eastern District has convinced them that we need to systematically identify and promote people who have been overlooked by traditional management structures." The news was incredible, representing the institutionalization of changes that had begun with Marcus's own transformation. The program would ensure that talented individuals wouldn't have to endure the kind of treatment he had experienced, and that companies could benefit from the capabilities of people who had been hiding in plain sight. "That's amazing," Marcus replied, his voice filled with gratitude for the opportunity to make such a widespread impact. "How many locations are we talking about?" "All of them," David said with a grin. "Every single Richardson Burger location in the country will implement the new management training and employee development protocols. You've helped us understand that our most valuable assets aren't our equipment or our real estate. They're the people who show up every day and care about doing good work." The conversation continued for another hour, with David sharing stories of other employees who had been promoted and recognized because of the new policies. Each success story reinforced Marcus's understanding that his personal struggles had been transformed into tools for positive change that would affect thousands of people. After the call ended, Marcus found Emma in the living room, practicing her exercises with the determination that had always amazed him. The new equipment that insurance now covered had made her therapy more effective, and the progress she was making gave both of them hope for continued improvement. As bedtime approached, Marcus helped Emma with her evening routine, the familiar ritual now filled with conversations about school projects, friends, and plans for the future. The desperate financial calculations that had once dominated his thoughts had been replaced by discussions of college possibilities, career dreams, and the adventures they would share when Emma was ready to explore the world. Before turning off the lights, Emma asked the question that had become part of their nightly routine. "Daddy, will you tell me about work today? I love hearing about the people you're helping." Marcus settled into the chair beside her bed, his heart full of gratitude for the opportunity to share stories of positive change rather than the carefully edited versions of survival that had once been necessary. Today he told her about a single mother in Phoenix who had been promoted to assistant manager after her talents were recognized, and about a veteran in Miami who had been given the training and support he needed to become a successful leader. Each story was a testament to the power of recognition and opportunity, proof that talent existed everywhere if leaders were willing to look beyond superficial judgments and give people the chance to prove themselves. Emma listened with the fascination of someone who understood that her father's work was about more than business success, it was about helping people find their way to better lives. If this story has touched your heart, let us know where you're listening from around the world. Subscribe for more stories about the extraordinary people we meet in ordinary places, and remember that every person you encounter has the potential to surprise you with their hidden capabilities and quiet strength. As Marcus turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from the depths of despair to a position where he could make a meaningful difference in the world. The tears he had shed in that restaurant parking lot had been transformed into the foundation for changes that would affect countless lives, proof that even the most difficult circumstances could become the source of something beautiful and lasting. The house settled into peaceful quiet, filled with the dreams of a father and daughter who had learned that hope was not just a wish but a choice, and that dignity and perseverance could overcome even the most challenging circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to help others find their way to recognition and success, continuing the ripple effects of transformation that had begun with one man's quiet refusal to give up on what was right. The story of Marcus Chen had become larger than his individual journey, evolving into a testament to the power of seeing people for who they really are and giving them the opportunity to prove their worth. In a world that too often overlooked the extraordinary in the ordinary, his experience served as a reminder that heroes worked in every kitchen, every office, and every corner of society, waiting only for someone to recognize their potential and give them the chance to shine.